October 14th, 1066, a hilltop near Hastings. King Harold Godwinson stood behind a wall of shields, watching 7,000 Norman cavalry, archers, and infantry form battle lines at the bottom of the slope. Harold had marched his army 300 miles in 2 weeks, fought and won a massive battle against Vikings just 3 weeks earlier, and now faced another invasion before his men could even rest. Across the valley, Duke William of Normandy, soon to be known as William the Conqueror, studied the English position and knew this would be the hardest fight of his life. He'd gambled everything on this invasion. If he lost today, he'd lose his army, his reputation, and probably his life. If he won, he'd become King of England and change history forever. By sunset, one of them would be dead. The other would rule England for the next 1,000 years. This is the story of Hastings, the most famous battle in British history. The day when an arrow, a broken oath, and 9 hours of brutal combat decided whether England would remain Saxon or become Norman. And the afternoon when William the Bastard, mocked throughout his life for his illegitimate birth, proved he deserved a different title, William the Conqueror. Welcome to Britain's history. Today we're diving into the battle everyone knows but few truly understand. A fight where Norman cavalry charged uphill into English axes for 9 hours, where thousands died in a space smaller than a football pitch, and where one arrow changed everything. Because Hastings wasn't just about tactics or armies. It was about whether England would develop as a Saxon kingdom or be transformed into something entirely new under Norman rule. But before we get to that famous arrow, before we watch the English shield wall break after holding all day, we need to understand how Duke William, a bastard son from Normandy, convinced himself he had the right to invade England. Because without knowing the succession crisis that brought 2 armies to this hillside, you can't appreciate what happened when they finally collided. And if you're enjoying this deep dive into history, make sure you're subscribed. We've got dozens more battles lined up, each one as dramatic as Hastings. Don't miss them. Let's go back to January 5th, 1066, when King Edward the Confessor died without producing an heir. Edward had ruled England for 23 years, building Westminster Abbey and maintaining relatively peaceful relations with Normandy, where he'd spent much of his early life in exile. But his greatest failure was dying childless, leaving behind competing claims to the English throne that would tear the country apart. 3 men believed they had legitimate rights to succeed Edward. Harold Godwinson, Earl of Wessex, was the most powerful nobleman in England and Edward's brother-in-law. He claimed Edward had designated him heir on his deathbed. The Witenagemot, the Council of English Nobles, elected Harold king the day after Edward died. Harold was crowned immediately at Westminster Abbey, knowing speed was essential if he wanted to establish his legitimacy before rivals could act. But Harold's claim had problems. He wasn't of royal blood, and more damaging, he'd supposedly sworn an oath to support a different claimant, Duke William of Normandy. According to Norman sources, Harold had been shipwrecked on the Norman coast in 1064, rescued by William, and forced to swear on holy relics that he'd support William's claim to the English throne. Harold argued the oath was extracted under duress and therefore invalid. William disagreed. To William, Harold was an oath-breaker, a usurper who'd stolen a throne that rightfully belonged to Normandy. The third claimant was Harold Hardrada, King of Norway, whose claim was weakest legally but backed by the strongest military force. Hardrada was a legend, the last great Viking warrior, a giant who'd fought from Constantinople to Sicily and never lost a battle. His claim went back to an agreement between previous English and Norwegian kings. It was tenuous, but Hardrada didn't care about legal niceties. He saw opportunity and took it. Think about Harold's position for a moment. You've just been crowned king. Immediately, the most feared Viking in Europe is sailing toward you with 300 ships. Meanwhile, across the Channel, the Duke of Normandy is assembling an invasion fleet and calling you an oathbreaker. 2 enemies, 2 invasions, and you can't fight both at once. What do you do? Drop your answer in the comments. Harold chose to deal with the Norwegian threat first. In September 1066, Hardrada landed in northern England with a massive Viking army. Harold executed one of history's great forced marches, racing his army north nearly 200 miles in 4 days. On September 25th, at Stamford Bridge near York, Harold's army caught the Vikings by surprise and destroyed them. Hardrada was killed. The Viking Age effectively ended that day. Harold had saved the north and proven himself a capable war leader. But 3 days later, on September 28th, Harold received catastrophic news. William of Normandy had landed on England's south coast with an invasion force. While Harold fought Vikings in Yorkshire, William had crossed the Channel with perhaps 7,000 men, knights, archers, and infantry, and established a beachhead near Hastings. Harold's army was in York, exhausted from battle and forced marching. William was in Sussex, fresh and fortifying his position. Harold had to march south immediately and fight another battle before his men could rest. Meanwhile, William was facing his own crisis. He'd landed successfully, but now he was stuck. His fleet was beached, preventing easy retreat. His army was relatively small. 7,000 men couldn't conquer England through siege warfare or prolonged campaigning. He needed Harold to come to him and fight a decisive battle. If Harold delayed, gathered reinforcements, and starved William's beachhead, the invasion would fail. William needed to provoke Harold into attacking quickly. So William did what invaders do when they need to force battle. He ravaged the countryside. Norman soldiers burned villages, looted farms, and terrorized the local population around Hastings. They were deliberately destroying Harold's own estates. Hastings was in Harold's earldom of Wessex. William was sending a message: "Come fight me, or watch your own lands burn." It worked. Harold, enraged and determined to drive the invaders out, marched south at maximum speed. Harold's march south was almost as impressive as his march north had been. In less than 2 weeks, his army covered nearly 250 miles from York to Sussex. But this march came at a cost. Harold's elite troops, his housecarls, professional warriors armed with deadly 2-handed axes, were exhausted. Many northern levies couldn't make the journey and had to be left behind. Harold's army that reached Sussex numbered perhaps 7,000 men, roughly equal to William's force. But they were tired, while William's Normans were rested. Harold reached the area near Hastings on October 13th, 1066. He positioned his army on Senlac Hill, a ridge about 7 miles north of Hastings, blocking the road to London. It was good defensive ground. the hill's slopes would tire attacking cavalry. The position was narrow enough that Harold's 7,000 men could form a solid defensive line across the entire ridge. And Harold's strategy was simple: form the shield wall, hold the high ground, and let the Normans exhaust themselves attacking uphill. If William wanted England, he'd have to come and take it. October 14th, 1066, dawned grey and cold. William deployed his army at the base of Senlac Hill in 3 divisions. On his left, Bretons and other French allies. In the centre, Normans under William's personal command. On the right, more French and Flemish troops. Each division mixed cavalry, infantry, and archers in a combined arms approach that was sophisticated for its time. William's plan was to soften the English line with archery, then send infantry to engage the shield wall, followed by cavalry charges to break through weakened sections. Harold's English army deployed along the ridge in a tight formation, perhaps 600 yards wide. In the centre stood Harold's housecarls, professional warriors in mail armour, each carrying a Danish axe that could split a man and his horse with one blow. On the flanks were the feared militia troops, less well armed, but fighting to defend their homes. Harold's strategy required no clever tactics. His men would lock shields, form an impenetrable wall, and refuse to break no matter how many times the Normans charged. English discipline against Norman aggression. High ground against cavalry. It should have worked. The battle began around 9 a.m. with Norman archers advancing up the slope and shooting volleys into the English line. But archery was less effective than William hoped. The English stood behind large shields that blocked most arrows, and because the English held high ground, arrows shot uphill lost force and often fell short or bounced harmlessly off shields and armour. The archery phase inflicted casualties, but didn't break the shield wall. William ordered his infantry forward. Norman foot soldiers advanced up the slope toward the English line, shields raised, swords drawn. When they reached the shield wall, brutal hand-to-hand combat erupted. English axes crashed down on Norman helmets and shields. Norman swords stabbed at gaps in the English formation. Men screamed, bled, and died in the press of bodies. But the English line held. The housecarls, veterans of decades of warfare, fought with discipline and ferocity. Norman infantry couldn't break through. William's cavalry charged next. Norman knights spurred their horses up the slope toward the English position. This was the Norman shock weapon. Armoured men on armoured horses, wielding lances and swords, trained from childhood for mounted combat. They were the finest cavalry in Europe, and they crashed uselessly against the English shield wall. The problem was simple. Horses won't charge into solid walls of men with sharp weapons. The English shield wall presented an unbroken barrier of shields, spears, and axes. Horses approaching this barrier slowed, swerved, or stopped. Norman knights couldn't generate the momentum needed for devastating impact. And when they got close to the English line, those Danish axes proved why they were feared. A two-handed axe could decapitate a horse, kill the rider through his armour, or simply smash both into the ground. Norman cavalry fell back, bloodied and frustrated. For hours, this pattern repeated. Norman infantry attacked uphill, engaged the shield wall in brutal combat, and were driven back. Norman cavalry charged, horses refusing to close with the English line, knights dying to English axes. Norman archers shot volleys that the English largely blocked with shields, and through it all, the English shield wall held, unbroken, immovable. Harold's strategy was working. If the English could maintain discipline through the afternoon, William's army would exhaust itself and retreat. But then the Normans discovered something that would change the battle. During one cavalry charge, the Norman left wing, the Bretons, broke and retreated down the slope in panic. English soldiers on Harold's right wing, seeing the enemy fleeing, broke formation and pursued them down the hill. It was a natural response. Chase fleeing enemies, kill them, claim victory. But it was also a fatal mistake. The Bretons weren't retreating in terror. They were fleeing because their attack had failed and they needed to regroup. But when English soldiers left their shield wall to pursue, they became vulnerable. Norman cavalry that had been unable to break the shield wall now found isolated English soldiers in the open, away from their defensive position. The Norman horsemen turned and cut them down. Hundreds of English soldiers died in minutes, caught in the open by cavalry they couldn't resist without their shield wall's protection. William saw this and learned a crucial lesson. The English would break formation if they thought the Normans were fleeing. So William ordered feigned retreats. Norman cavalry would charge the English line, engage briefly, then pretend to flee in panic. English soldiers, believing they'd won, would break ranks to pursue. Then Norman cavalry would turn and massacre them. It was cynical, brilliant, and devastating. Each feigned retreat killed dozens of English soldiers who broke discipline. But even with these tactics, the English centre held. Harold's housecarls maintained formation. The third on the flanks had learned not to pursue retreating Normans. The battle was grinding towards stalemate. Both sides were exhausted, casualties mounted. Neither side could deliver a decisive blow. As afternoon turned toward evening, it seemed Harold might survive long enough for William to give up and retreat to his ships. Then fortune intervened. Around 4 p.m., after 7 hours of continuous combat, Norman archers tried a different approach. Instead of shooting directly at the English line, which allowed the English to block arrows with raised shields, the archers shot high arcing volleys that fell on the English from above. Arrows rained down on the English position, striking men who'd lowered shields or weren't looking up. Casualties increased, and one arrow, we'll never know if it was aimed or random, struck King Harold. The exact circumstances of Harold's death are debated. The Bayeux tapestry, created by Norman victors to commemorate the battle, shows a figure labelled Harold with an arrow in his eye. Later, Norman sources claim Harold was struck by an arrow, then finished off by Norman knights who hacked him to pieces. English sources are mostly silent. They lost, so they didn't write triumphant accounts. What's certain is that sometime in the late afternoon, King Harold died. Whether from an arrow to the eye or from Norman swords after being wounded, Harold fell defending his kingdom. Harold's death broke the English army. When word spread that the king was dead, English morale collapsed. The housecarls around Harold's standard, his closest warriors, fought to the death defending his body. They refused to surrender, refused to flee, and died where they stood. But the feared militia, learning their king was dead and their cause lost, began withdrawing from the hilltop. The shield wall, which had held for 9 hours, finally cracked. William ordered a general assault. Norman cavalry and infantry surged up the hill, overrunning English positions, pursuing fleeing soldiers, and turning the battle into a rout. English soldiers who tried to surrender were often killed anyway. Norman blood was up after 9 hours of brutal fighting. The retreat became a slaughter. Hundreds of English died fleeing through the woods and marshes around Hastings. The feared who'd fought so bravely all day were hunted down and killed as they tried to reach their homes. The casualties at Hastings were catastrophic by medieval standards. Perhaps 2,000 English died, including King Harold, his brothers Gurth and Leofwine, and most of the English nobility who'd gathered for the battle. Norman losses were probably similar, around 2,000 killed, but the difference was stark. England had lost its king, its leadership class, and its ability to resist further Norman conquest. William had won, but his army was intact enough to continue the campaign. William didn't immediately march on London. His army needed rest and reinforcements. He spent weeks consolidating his position around Hastings, waiting for English resistance to collapse. It did. Without Harold, without leadership, without an army, English nobles began submitting to William. On Christmas Day, 1066, William was crowned King of England at Westminster Abbey. The Norman conquest was complete. But Hastings didn't just change who sat on England's throne. It changed England itself, fundamentally and permanently. William brought Norman administration, Norman law, Norman architecture, and Norman French language. English nobles were replaced by Norman lords. English became a subject language, spoken by peasants, while Norman French dominated courts and government. English culture was suppressed, absorbed, transformed by Norman influence over generations. The conquest also connected England to continental Europe in ways that shaped the next 500 years. English kings now held lands in France, Normandy, and eventually much more, creating conflicts of loyalty and eventually the 100 Years' War. English language absorbed thousands of French words, creating the hybrid English we speak today. English law developed through Norman systems combined with Saxon traditions. Modern England, its institutions, its language, its culture, was born from the fusion of Saxon and Norman that began at Hastings. Within 200 years of Hastings, William's descendants would control more of France than the French king. Within 400 years, England would be challenging France for European dominance. Within 800 years, Britain would rule the largest empire in history. The fusion of Norman administrative genius and English maritime tradition, begun at Hastings, created the nation that would dominate the world for centuries. That's what makes Hastings matter. Not just who won a battle, but what that victory created. England could have developed as a Saxon kingdom, probably absorbed into Scandinavia's orbit, culturally isolated from continental Europe. Instead, Hastings made England Norman, connected it to France, created conflicts that shaped European history for centuries, and ultimately produced the hybrid Anglo-Norman culture that became modern Britain. One arrow, one afternoon, one battle, and everything changed. If this is the kind of history that fascinates you, the turning points, the battles that created nations, the moments when the world pivoted on decisions made in desperate hours, then you know what to do. This channel exists because these stories deserve to be told. What other conquest battles should we cover? Drop your suggestions below. Thank you for watching Britain's history. The stories that mattered, told the way they deserved.